Hello, this is Dr. Anthony Delmond. We've been speaking about assessing customer needs and preferences on the aggregate level, but now we need to shift over and start talking about assessing individual customer needs and buyer psychology. Teaching about buyer psychology and how to read your buyers is really difficult. You can share a lot of lessons, you can discuss this in detail, but it really takes experience and someone's ability to take that experience and apply it. It is easier to classify buying situations and buyer types, which is what we'll start out with here, and move on into a discussion of the Myers-Briggs system of personality types. So there are three broadly defined levels of decision-making: routine decision-making, limited decision-making, and extensive decision-making. We can talk about each one of these in turn, but the level depends on the customer. It depends on the complexity of a product, and it depends on a lot of other factors. For what might be a routine decision-making process for one person, another person might find that product to be more taxing. So let's talk about each one of these. Routine decision-making is for simple, cheap products that don't require much buyer engagement. Not a lot of information needs to be processed to make a decision. So things like toothbrushes or chewing gum, these are pretty easy. We make them out of habit, and we don't have to put a lot of energy into the process. There's not a lot of risk of making the wrong decision. The consequences are low. So there's a couple different ways that we make these routine decisions. One is by inertia or habit. We typically make the same decision about our toothbrushes, so we don't really think about it. We don't go through and investigate what the other options are. We just do something based on habit. Inertia is the existing push of having done it before, so we're going to call that habit here. Or we may make a split-second decision. If you didn't plan to make a purchase, you may make an impulse buy. Pack of gum at the counter would be a good example of this. So again, toothbrushes or gum, depending on which we're talking about. Jumping to the other end of the spectrum, there's also an extensive decision-making process that requires a customer's full engagement. This is going to be for items that are complex, maybe expensive, maybe there's a lot of information to process, and when the consequences are very high for making the wrong decision. If we're talking about purchasing a car and you purchase the wrong car, that's a big risk. You spend a lot of money and you can't really do much to fix that problem once you've created it for yourself. So first home, obviously you make a wrong decision, it's taxing. There's a lot of energy that goes into this. People don't just make a wild home purchase, usually on impulse. Small farm purchasing a new combine, another good example. In between, we have limited decision making. This is going to be for things that require some processing of information, but not tons. The consequences might not be enormous, but they might still be somewhat substantial. So things that are moderately complex, maybe moderately expensive. Things that would fall into this category might be for a fairly wealthy person or a person who's upper middle class, making a decision about a new television or a laptop might fall into this category. Whereas for a student, a new television or a laptop might fall into the more extensive decision-making process because that's a big proportion of your income to go to that. So for a student, maybe choosing a streaming service or internet provider is going to be a limited decision-making process, whereas for someone that is extraordinarily poor, this may be more extensive. For someone that is very wealthy, this might be even a routine decision-making process. So again, it depends on the product and the person involved. So that discusses the buying situations, but we also want to think about buyers specifically. How do we categorize people and understand what people are going to want to do, how their behavior is affected by their personalities? And one of the ways that we've done this is create personality types. One of the big examples that we have used in the past is the Myers-Briggs personality types developed in the early to middle of the last century. I'm not going to go through the history of the Myers-Briggs personality types because That's in the textbook, so have a look at that. But here we're just going to kind of go over some of the basics. There are 4 classic dichotomies or type indicators, and those are introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving. And we can go through each one of those, but every person is going to fit more into one side than the other for each one of these, and that will create 16 distinct types, 4 times 4. The first type indicator indicates somebody's introversion or extroversion. We kind of have a view of what introversion and extroversion are, but it's usually different from what it truly is. So we're going to go through these a little bit. Introverts are thought-oriented people. These are people who recharge by being alone or being in very small groups. It's not necessarily that they don't like being around big groups, it's that they don't recharge from being around big groups. So it's not that they're hiding in their shells, it's that they prefer for comfort to be in smaller groups or by themselves. Extroverts, on the other hand, are action-oriented and they recharge by being in large groups. It's not that they don't like being alone sometimes, but it's that they get their battery recharged, so to speak, by being in highly socially engaged environments. People don't always fit perfectly into one of these, and this is true for every one of these dichotomies we're going to talk about. So people have different levels of introversion or extroversion. Somebody might be very close to the center. They sometimes recharge one way or sometimes recharge the other way. It's very rare to have a person that fits perfectly into one category, but we can make our decisions based on where people seem to fall. The second indicator involves a person's sensing or intuition. Sensors are those people who rely on very concrete information or things that can be physically sensed to make their decisions. They're going to make practical decisions based on today, based on the current situation. They're not going to think too much about how the future is going to be affected or how the past is going to be affected. Whereas intuitors take facts and abstract concepts and draw conclusions on their own. They take a bigger picture of the world, and sometimes they're going to be a little more future-oriented. They're not going to fall as easily into routine. They're going to want to make big picture decisions. Sorry, this is going to be the third type indicator. That's going to determine a person's thinking or feeling. So thinkers are people who use objective criteria and facts to make rational decisions. That sounds sort of similar to the other, but they're not necessarily as big picture. A lot of times they're seen as lacking empathy. This is more about rationality. People who are thinkers are typically highly rational. They make very clear decisions following a very logical structure. Feelers, on the other hand, make decisions that are a lot of times based on emotion and feeling, as opposed to just being based exclusively on facts and logical reasoning. So again, very few people fit perfectly into the thinking or feeling category, but some people are more emotion-oriented and some people are more logical reasoning-oriented. And then the last, I've got the second for all these, I'll have to change that. The last type indicator is judging versus perceiving. Judgers are going to seek organizational and control. They're going to prefer to have task lists. They're going to be very organized, and they're going to follow that task list throughout the day to make sure that, and throughout the year and so on, to make sure that they meet all their goals. They don't like surprises. They don't like confusion, so it's very, very rigidly structured. Perceivers are the opposite. They prefer things to be more spontaneous. They might not keep lists or schedules at all. And it's sometimes harder to work with a perceiver on a project because to do a project with a group, you need people that are more detail-oriented or at least organizationally coordinated. And perceivers typically don't fit that. But they can be very ambitious, but they're also very adaptable to change. So if you have a list of things that need to get done and things need to change, perceivers are better at making that shift. The Myers-Briggs system is somewhat flawed. It doesn't perfectly outline personalities as we thought it did 60, 70 years ago, but it's a good jumping off point. It gives us some ways to look at this, and they've expanded this to include some other things, but there are other personality indicators as well. This is just a good point for us to be able to kind of make some generalizations. So among agricultural college students, the highest frequency personality types are the following here. Extroverted sensors, thinking and judging, and extroverted sensors, feeler, judger. So those are the two most common. Another extroverted one is the ESTP. That's extroversion, sensor, thinker, perceiver, and those are really compatible with farm and ranch management positions. We also see here that ISTJ, ISFJ, and ISTP are all pretty common. You could maybe see some trends in here that connect to agricultural jobs. Some of these that are pretty common. One thing you might notice is that going back to our true second personality type, sensing versus intuition, most of the agricultural college students are sensing. We don't have any, in fact, that are intuiting. This means that most agricultural students make practical decisions based on now, but don't take as large a view. That's not to say that they can't, but it's just not as common among the agricultural students. We see the same sort of thing in the careers as well. But 73.3% of the population are sensors, so it makes sense that that a majority here are also sensors. So we want to be able to functionalize this. You can make certain decisions based on the type of person that you are selling to. It's always easier to sell to the type of people you are. So if you're selling to farmers and you fit into this typical personality type that the farmers are, then you're going to have an easier time making those connections. It's difficult to come up with somebody's specific personality type, but you can maybe pick up on some of the key characteristics from these Myers-Briggs personality types. So if you're dealing with an extroverted person, you can focus on how things are going to affect larger groups. You can, if you're dealing with somebody who is a very rational thinker, you're going to want to make a very rational argument when you're selling the product, and maybe appeal more to fact and logical reasoning than you would to the emotional side, and vice versa if it's somebody that's more of a feeler. So it's really important to kind of judge ahead of time what type of person you're dealing with to know how best to tailor the conversation. Understanding a person's personality is really important, but it's only the first step. And in the next section, we're going to start talking about communication, how we can read our customers directly and sort of think about how to determine what personality type they fit into. But at least we have the groundwork now to move forward. All right, so you've got some keywords to look at. There's quite a few from this lecture. Go ahead and make sure that you go through those before doing the module assignment.